Hello, everyone. For over a decade now, in my spare time, when I'm on my own, I've been practicing the internal arts, meditation and yoga. And over the course of my practice, I've been developing an internal art, which is the harmonization primarily of the yogic and Qigong systems. And in this episode, I want to share a little bit about this practice and the underlying, you could say, philosophy and the foundations of this practice. Share a little bit about how the practice may look in its many forms and why you should care about this practice. That's a good question. This practice is my lifeline. It's the most foundational piece from my balance, and I know that it can help others because I've taught it to many individuals in various ways, and I've seen the results of it. Because these practices, the internal arts practices, they're about inner self cultivation, and we're always cultivating ourselves. We're always growing and evolving. And this practice, the Wuji practice and all internal arts proper, have this emphasis on the internal cultivation of our body, our emotions, and our mind, and our spirit. They're embodiment and empowerment practices. They're self-healing, self-regulating, and self-realization practices. When practiced, they increase our intuition and our internal guidance. They give us balance within, and they promote a lifestyle of balance. Talking about like mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual balance, yeah? They help us with our alignment, not just our physical alignment of the dense structures of our body, but our energetic alignment, like focusing our mind on our dream and creating a thought stream of one-pointedness and like coordination and organization with what we want and desire. And they help us to optimize our energy, as well as to alchemize any stuck energy, blocked energy, energy that is chaotic or noxious, energy we don't want in the system. And at the level of like mind, this represents our limiting beliefs and negative beliefs, old stories that are stuck in the body as much as they are in the mind. And the practice is like, the alchemy is the internal exchange we're making with the universe with every breath, with the foundational way in which we intercourse with life as we enter into it with our being and our body, our stories, and what we're holding. And we can alchemize our whole physical body, certainly make a transformation, but more important in the deeper teachings of internal arts is to also alchemize our mind. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but inner self-cultivation is ultimately to purify the mind so that it can more beautifully, you could say, reflect the spirit. Because when the mind is muddied with our habit pattern conditioning and our limiting and negative beliefs, we begin to see through that lens. And at the higher levels of practice, when we're working with the mind, we have this opportunity to clear the mind at a very refined level so that more of our soul and spirit can guide us through this life, creating more harmony for us and ultimately for the whole planet and everybody that we come in contact with. And we're always in contact with everybody, all of our relations at each and every moment. And it does this through movement intelligence and certain practices that are very specific to certain things. I think of these practices as prescriptive, like meditation, medication, yeah? But I'll get a little bit more into the actual practice shortly. So let's go back a little bit. Let's go back to the origins of this practice. I mentioned that I've been practicing for over 10 years, and I started off with meditation in terms of more of a formal internal art. I've been practicing physical exercise, which would be more of an external art, for a long time. And even, I'll be honest, the way that I'm articulating these practices now is not how I've been practicing for the last 10 years. Some of this stuff is a lot more recent. Some of this stuff tracks back a lot further because I just didn't know. I didn't know there was such a differentiation between an external art and an internal art. And still to this day, I'm learning. I'm learning so much. I consider myself a beginner in these arts after 10 years. And I think I'll still be a beginner by the end of my life. So these practices aren't things that I really care in some sense to master. I do them because they're like my lifeblood. They're more of an expression to who I am. And this is something I want to inspire in people. Like, we're always practicing something. So let your being be the one that moves you. And these practices can, as I mentioned, it can help us to release the patterns that aren't us, the conditioning, so that it's our being that moves us. And whether or not we reach total enlightenment with these practices, at the stage where I'm at, that may be the ultimate goal, but it's not something I hold in my mind. I don't think that actually helps too much. Excessive desire for that, I feel like, is just going to prevent us. Have you ever desired something so much you just want it, you want it, you want it, and you want it, and you don't get it, and then you let it go, and it comes to you naturally on its own time? It's kind of one of those things, I feel, yeah. So I've been practicing these arts for over 10 years, and the primary systems are yoga and Qigong. My main influences with yoga have been embodied flow yoga, Dharma yoga, Kundalini yoga, the 26 and 2 series, formerly known as the Bikram series, and then the Kriya Yoga system. Kriya Yoga being, there's a number of different Kriya Yogas as well as Kundalini, and I'm sure Dharma and embodied yoga. There's so many yogas out there nowadays. The Kriya Yoga system is from the lineage of Babaji and Paramahamsa Yogananda and Paramahamsa Prajnananda, who's the current lineage holder. This is very much, you could say, a meditation system. It doesn't have a lot of the asanas or the physical postures that many people know and practice in yoga studios. When I talk a little bit more about the inner self-cultivation pathway, about how we cultivate our body, our mind, and eventually into spiritual cultivation, I'll get a little bit more into this. And I'll be sharing perspectives, even though it can be a little bit, you could say, dicey to do it between, because I do, in some sense, harmonize yoga and Qigong in one system in this practice of Wuji. And did I even say the name of Wuji? That's the practice, by the way, if I haven't already shared. The practice is Wuji. This is the name that I've given it. And I've named it Wuji because it's a Taoist term. It comes more from Qigong than yoga for sure. And Wuji means like ultimate emptiness, great emptiness, absolute void, things of this nature. And in the Taoist cosmology, there is the Tao, which is like the primordial, unmanifested source of all energy and everything. And then the Tao interacts with the Wuji, with the infinite emptiness. The infinite emptiness is like space, outer space, the vast openness through which the light of creation is able to draw itself. Like a blank piece of paper is a canvas. And we're surrounded by the void. If you are in a space right now where there's energy all around you. And this is the Wuji. This is the infinite field of potential. And in terms of movement, there are many different ways you can move and interact within the dimensional space around you in the Wuji. And so too your mind in its mind space, and the mind field around you has a infinite field in which to interact and create with the imagination, with your tethered to the Tao and its infinite capacity. So I really like the Wuji, but Wuji has a lot more. And one of the other things I'll share about it is that Wuji is also the primary posture in a lot of Qigong systems. And Wuji is the standing posture. It's the standing posture If you're more familiar with yoga, it's like standing shavasana in some sense. It's a neutral position to stand in, not like mountain pose, depending on who teaches mountain pose, I suppose. But mountain pose is a pose. And when we pose, we want to organize and align our energy in a certain way. There's a certain intention. Whereas Wuji is much more about coming into neutrality and not imposing any direction on the energy. So it's often done in the beginning of practice to stabilize the mind in neutrality, in balance, in a fairly active posture. Standing is not active in the sense of like dancing or martial arts, but it's active in that we look to relax, and it's active relaxation, because if you think about relaxation, most people go to like lying on the couch. Not that kind of relaxation, but active relaxation. And I'm not going to get into the principles of how to actively relax and how the muscles hang from the bone. It's quite an articulate and specific process of how to do this in a good way. But the importance of the Wuji is, well, if you don't have Wuji, you don't have the stillness cultivated from Wuji. You don't have a depth in the practice of movement, because it's from stillness we move. Now, I can't explain this until you've experienced it, but there's something so different between the constant movement that happens, and I'll share from my personal life. It felt like I stopped for the first time after how many decades? I don't know, 20 something decades, not 20 something decades, 20 plus years, 2.5-ish decades, when I finally entered a level of stillness. And this stillness is not just the body becoming still, it's the mind becoming still enough. And before this, I would have said like, oh, I've been still, I fall asleep, I've been relaxed, smoked a lot of dope and sat there for hours. And that touches upon a bit of what I'm sharing here. But the depth of stillness to what I experienced then and to what I can experience now is just incalculable to talk about. Because the real depth there is not just the body becoming still, and the body becomes ever more still so that you can feel the most subtle sensations, like through the organs and even eventually down into the cellular consciousness. But it's also the mind stillness, because the mind is perpetually running and parallel processing for most people all the time. Even from the time they're getting close to bed and relaxing into their sleep, it's still processing. But there are practices and ways to focus the mind that it becomes very glass-like, if not totally glass-like, depending on your absorption. And this level of stillness is a whole nother level. And this is like part of a process of learning to develop stillness, so that that stillness can be integrated into the practice of movement. And this will have such a profound effect on an individual's life as they move through their life with greater stillness. They first develop and cultivate this in their practice, because it takes this dedicated period to truly get to this level of stillness. And once this stillness is integrated into your system and you can arrive at it, you learn to get there quicker and quicker. So that when you start your practice in the standing posture, the stillness can also be done from seated and lying, which are the three postures that you'd want to practice in some sense on your own to develop alongside of the other movements. Because if we just keep practicing movement, we're just continuing to move the mind. Mind's already been moving. And there's a value to that, of course. But these practices have these underlying foundations. I'll speak more to the Qigong side at this point here. The Qigong foundation here is in Taoism and in the Yin and Yang, the Tai Chi symbol. And the Yin and Yang is about balance, is about balancing movement and stillness. So when we want to find harmony between the polarities, which these practices teach at gross levels, physical, energetic, all the levels of polarity within your body and being and mind. There's an opportunity to balance these at an ever more refined level. And we do this through Wuji. We do this from moving and then coming back into stillness. From moving and coming back into stillness. And integrating. And when we move and then come back into stillness, say we do a movement and we do it 10 times and then we come back into stillness, that movement has a ripple in the nervous system. Now, if we just move from one activity to the next, to the next, to the next, we don't feel the subtleties of that ripple in the system because there's too much information to process. So if we do one movement, we repeat it several times and then come back into stillness, we'll feel the ripple of that at a very subtle level as it moves through the mind and the energy bodies, yeah? So there's very specific ways of practicing. There's a cadence to the sessions. Many different styles of practice, just like I feel like talking about yoga, more people are familiar, more of like a vinyasa or power style versus a hatha or a yin style where it's much more slower. Anyways, I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about the Wuji standing in a little bit, but I do want to get back to the origins of this, now that you actually know the name of the practice as Wuji. And so I had talked a little bit about my influences in yoga, and then I practiced a lot of Qigong over the last few years. Primary systems are shamanic and medical Qigong, as well as Neigong, which I'll explain in a moment. All of Qigong, in some sense, is shamanic. There's like a group of women called the Wu, the W-U in ancient China. And in many ways, as I've been taught, this is the origin of Qigong. These were a shamanistic group of women who, through various means, some proposed plant medicines, but a lot of natural means, as you might expect from these internal arts, through meditation, through their breath, through awareness, through fasting, through ritual and ceremony, these individuals would become so absorbed, connected to nature, so sensitive in their body that they created, you could say, Qigong, or discovered it within them. And they discovered all the energy lines that we know from traditional Chinese medicine as meridians. Eventually these became charted and put into traditional Chinese medicine. So Qigong is one of the four main branches of traditional Chinese medicine, along with herbs, massage, and acupuncture. It's the oldest branch and it's the origin branch. A fun fact, originally there was a lot of practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine who would be trained in all the branches. So for example, the West has, you could say, been brought traditional Chinese medicine, and it's become a very masculine art in that it's become very linear and prescriptive. You have this condition, you put acupuncture needles here, you put them in, you walk away, that's it. Whereas before, the Qigong added a much more feminine aspect to it, where it's not so masculine and standardized in that way. Like a practitioner would not just like learn your symptoms and look up in a book where to put points. They would have a intuitive understanding of their body and energy and yours, and they would, yes, do the standard like tongue diagnosis and these things, but they would also read your energy body. This could be through like pulse diagnosis, but also be through Qigong, putting their hands over your body and these sorts of things. And then once they have their intuitive diagnosis, as well as you could say their standard diagnosis of what's like textbook, then they would place the needles, and they wouldn't just walk away after that. They would offer qi transmission. They would offer energy into those needles to help the process there. So in some sense, we've lost that whole feminine part of the traditional Chinese medicine, especially in the acupuncture domain. And this is one of the systems that I trained in, not the acupuncture part, but the shamanic Qigong energy healing. So it does come from these Wu individuals, the original Wu, you could say, which were the females, and there was a group of males. They were the Wu Jing. Don't know the exact name on that as well. And from what I've heard, those are the ones that wrote it down. Typical, the masculine having that standardization and writing things down in a more linear, formal fashion, whereas the feminine being more oratory and keeping it in the intuition and transmission in a different way. That's just a little side note. The medical Qigong practices that come out of that and have evolved since then is something I've trained quite a bit in. So these Qigong practices are primarily aimed at the purging and tonifying and regulating of the body and the body system, such as the 12 meridians from traditional Chinese medicine theory. So there are specific movement practices, massages, sounds, and you could say meditations and a number of other psychotherapeutic processes. The lineage and the teachings that I've received do carry some more modern and external influences, which you wouldn't think of as Qigong proper, such as shamanic trance and these kinds of things. And these are all supportive psychotherapeutically when an individual has an imbalance in the body. And when I say imbalance, that's any imbalance of yin and yang energy, but this is also the way that a lot of individuals speak about traditional Chinese medicine when they're sharing about organs. They don't say disease as like one thing. It's more an imbalance, and then they articulate what that imbalance is in accordance with their system, which is traditionally the 5-element system, working with the 5 yin organs, working with meridian theory, the 12 major meridians and 8 extraordinary vessels, and yin and yang theory, etc., etc. Anyways, put a tag in that. Might talk about that later. And then Neigong. My primary teacher in Qigong is Wendy Lang, and this is from the Jerry Allen Johnson texts and his work, which was one of her teachers. And then studying Neigong, my primary teacher has been Demo Mitchell. Neigong is, well, it's Qigong. Neigong is the more internal aspect of Qigong. And then Neigong is the, I would say, like a leading up process to Neidan, which is a deeper inner alchemical transformation that is ultimately guided towards self-realization. In some sense, you can split Qigong into medical, martial, and spiritual. Medical, I've talked a little bit about. Martial would be about developing power in the system, which would be applied towards martial arts, such as like Shaolin Kung Fu, as well as other Chinese martial arts. And then Neigong is the inner alchemical process of refining your Jing, which is a traditional Chinese medicine, an alchemical term for your more manifest energy that resides in the kidneys, to refine your Jing to your Qi, which is your subtle, more energetic energy field, and then refining that to your Shen, which is translated as mind, and at the higher level to spirit. And I'll talk a little bit about that process in a little bit. But Neigong involves the development of your Dantian, which is one of the primary energy centers in the body. Yoga, as many people know, uses the 7 chakras as their primary, you could say, highway to super consciousness, from base to Sahasrara. Whereas the Qigong system, they both have within them the others. I mean, there's chakras in the Qigong systems, but most of the practices are focused around the development of the energy centers, dantians, and there's 3 major ones. There's a whole bunch I could say about locations and disputations and these kind of things. This isn't a whole developed talk on Neigong and these arts in that way, so I'm just going to be very light on that and say what I've said there and then move on, yeah? So other influences for the Wuji practice, we have dance, working out, Osho dynamic meditations, conscious connected breathwork, and massage. And what I mean by these are other influences, once I get a little bit more into sharing about the practice, this may make more sense. But I've created this art from my own personal practice. And because I love to do all the things just mentioned and many other things such as martial arts and other ways of moving my body, when I practice on my own, these things come out because I don't always just practice a set sequence from a certain lineage. I am tuning into my body. I am wanting to express in various ways, as I mentioned, very prescriptive. It's like medication, yeah. It's like what's going on in my system and how can I best support this energy? How can I best balance it from my empowerment and embodiment to self-heal at this moment, to optimize my energy, to alchemize. And there's so many teachings and practices that can be interwoven at various levels. So there's a lot of influence from those systems in the internal art. So what the heck is an internal art? Like, how can I go deeper into this thing called internal art, and how is it different from an external art? External arts focus more on the external, on using the large muscles as the prime movers of the body. And typically these arts are more externally focused, meaning that you're doing something, which is the emphasis. This could be performance. This could be a dance performance. This could be a sporting event. This could be an external goal, a marathon. So this is the emphasis. This is where the primary energy and focus of the mind is on something outside of you, and you're primarily focused on your external body. Now, of course, external arts have internal focus because your mindset and your body conditioning and your breath, etc., are all part of that process. And at the higher levels of high-level athletes, they're for sure optimizing these things and working on them in various ways, yeah? Internal arts have their primary focus on the inside, and internal arts proper, if you will, has the emphasis on self-realization or enlightenment as the final goal. That being said, a lot of the body practices and body conditioning is for harmonization and balancing of the system rather than for exercise output. For example, in the yogic systems, in the 8 limbs of yoga, as put out by Patanjali, the asana, the physical posture, is known as a comfortable seat, or it's like to condition the body for health so that it can sit for long periods of time and to move through the postures in a way where you can be meditative. So in my understanding, as we start to become very like exercise based in our yoga, we can in some sense be a little bit away from that point, though that does have a application in health and wellness for sure, and I do enjoy those practices. When we see it within the goal being enlightenment and the goal of the asana and many of the posturing practices to be a vehicle towards greater stillness, towards greater meditation, the practices will typically be taught in a different way because of the intention being different. And the internal arts, once again, if they're looking towards going towards enlightenment, there'll be focuses on the qualities of mind that ultimately we want to purify our mind so that more clearly reflects the spirit. So to better explain this, I'm going to talk about the Yi Jin Jing and the process of transforming the body how the mind affects our practice, and then I'll touch briefly on the higher level of spiritual process that evolves in the long run of these practices. Forgive me, but I don't actually know the original writer of the Yi Jin Jing. Also, can be translated, pardon me, as the muscle tendon changing classic. I think it's not even known who did it, but they propose that it may be Bodhidharma, the legendary, I think he's a Zen Buddhist monk, though he traveled throughout India, and then he came to China and taught Shaolin, and he was a martial artist and a master meditator, and there's some wild stories about him that seem semi-poetic and mythical, which often when you have genuine realized masters, their life is seemingly mythical but actually factual. So who knows? I don't personally know this dude, so I can't really say. But the Yi Jin Jing proposes a process of transformation which articulates the internal art cultivation process quite well. And it's going to act as a springboard to share some of the ways in which I bring forward these teachings that differentiates it from the external arts. So the Yi Jin Jing proposes a multi-step process. It's like a roadmap, and it's about using the qi to transform the body. And qi, many people just say it as energy, and that has a lot of validity. But there's so many different types of qi. There's yin qi, there's yang qi, there's gu qi, there's wei qi, all different types of qi in these systems, from the alchemical traditions to the traditional Chinese medicine traditions. So sure, we can use the word energy. Yeah, let's just go with energy for now, just for present purposes. The qi, we want to transform various structures in the body, such as the huang. Maybe pronouncing that wrong, pardon me. I do not speak Chinese, and I've read a lot of these things and I've heard them pronounced, but my verbalization, my articulation of them is not always precise because I haven't had them taught to me and mirrored back to me whether I'm doing it right or wrong, so forgive me there. Haung. So this can be translated, I've heard, as the connective tissue, possibly the fascia, and I've also heard things that would go against that. In some of the teachings, it's the thing that fills the spaces in between and connects all things. And in many ways, it is pointing, you could say, to the fascia. So we could loosely define it as that, though it's not necessarily to exactly define these to understand this process. So we have the qi affecting the huang, and this is going to eventually affect the sinews and then the tendons and the muscles. Now, there's a whole lot I can go into this in terms of defining this process, but this isn't a podcast on the Yi Jin Jing specifically, so we're not going to go into great detail. The idea is, if you use your external muscle, you're contracting the muscle and you're creating force. Through resistance exercise, such as lifting weights, you'll stress the muscle, and then the muscle will repair itself and grow. This is an external way of growing the body. But in terms of energy moving through the system, the muscles don't have a lot of conductivity where subtle energy moves through them. They're a very external aspect of the body. Whereas structures such as the meridians are the primary highways for the subtle energy of qi to move through the body. And then the huang, if you will, or the connective tissue, we can call it fascia for now, has a lot more dense nerve supply through it, also much better vehicle for conducting energy through the system. So if we're working in terms of energy, we want to work from the energy out. Now, there's ways of training the body where the qi is built in the dantian. Not going to go deeply into that process at this point, but the qi is built in the dantian, and then the qi and the energy moves the body from the inside rather than from the outside. I'm just going to touch on that briefly once again, though I could go into a lot greater detail. External movement, primarily from the prime phasic muscles of the body, the ones we know and love, the quads, the glutes, biceps, these kinds of things, prime movers. Whereas internal movement, we learn to move with our mind and energy and even with our breath. This is one of the reasons why you're in a yoga class, they teach you to breathe as you move. The breath being the source of the movement. And there's not just the breath that sources it. There's a certain way of moving the body with relaxation and sinking and not contracting the major muscles. And also through the development of the Wuji standing posture, which is going to build the system different, where we can move the system in a way where the prime movers aren't engaged in the same way. And the whole system develops differently, which is going to put more emphasis on stretching the fascia. When the fascia becomes stretched, it becomes more strong. Eventually, this will affect as well the tendons and what's known as the sinews, which will build the muscles or the body from the inside, starting from the smallest structure to the largest structure, which is the end point is the musculature. Whereas in the external training, the beginning point is the musculature that's emphasized. Where in this process, the energy is the first point and the muscle is the last point. So to offer an example, and there's not that many examples that you could look to outside of people who've done these internal arts, because as we go into this at a superficial level, yes, you get, I'm sure that you breathe as you move, and that will develop different. If you practice some yoga, you can get a sense for that in your body. But to go through the deeper practices of standing and developing a dantian, it builds the system in a whole different way. But you can think of, just for now, like picture a Chinese martial artist or a martial artist of any kind that isn't very muscular, but they can do 200 push-ups. Maybe a Jackie Chan or somebody who's incredibly fit, but they're not jacked in a traditional way. They have an incredible body capacity with what they can do, like a Tony Jaa, and they can move their system in a very developed way because their connective tissue and the interrelationships in their body are very fluid and flowing, like a dancer. They have a quality of strength, and they haven't trained their body with the large muscles to move masses of weight. It's just a different direction of training, right? And they've built their body in a different way. Now, once again, we're not looking in the Yi Jin Jing process necessarily to become martial artists. Remember, our intention with these practices is everything. The primary intention in internal arts proper, I'm just using that term for the process of looking more towards enlightenment, is towards meditation and towards greater stillness and refining the mind so that the spirit can move through. Now, as part of your process, you may find martial arts very supportive towards the internal arts, and often Tai Chi and Qigong is practiced alongside many external martial arts as a more complete way of doing life, lifestyle, exercise, and living a full life. Interestingly, a lot of external ways of practicing and external things like working out actually run counter to the Yi Jin Jing process, especially when developing the initial stages of it. So I've gone through it various times, and I'm going through a period now where it's been almost 6 months of very little working out, using my prime muscles and using weights. I use some body weight. I use very lightweight from time to time. I've been primarily focusing on my yogic and internal arts practices. And it's winter right now, so I've been taking a lot more time to rest and meditate rather than focus on my internal arts, because I do a seasonal periodization in my practices where I practice more stillness in the winter and more movement in the summer. And it's a spectrum between there, yeah? Because I've been explaining it, that the external movement is so focused on doing it the opposite way of what the internal movement is. And this isn't to say one is better than the other. Once again, this is just about intentions and a system of practice. And there are just many systems. This is the one that I've chosen to focus on and commit myself to. And I have personally experienced trying to build my body both externally and internally, and it runs counter to one another. So this is where periodization comes in. This is working on things for a set period. Just like if you really, really want to focus on an aspect of your physical fitness, focus on that. Doesn't mean you have to do that always. You can parallel process and condition. How would that look? Well, if you're trying to gain a bunch of weight and density and mass in your body, it wouldn't always support you to be running a whole lot and doing cardiovascular exercise. This could be seen as something, we'll work on the weight training for a bit and then take a period where you work on the cardio, and then over time those would integrate together, and perhaps you could practice them both at a certain time if that's more representative of your goals in your sport or what you love to do. But trying to run all the time is a much different stressor, therapeutic stressor on the body than working out. If you're trying to lose weight and you're trying to gain muscle mass, these can be counter, right? You want to intelligently practice. So anyways, the Yi Jin Jing process is the process of transformation of the body in a very specific way. I'll say a few more words about this before moving on. So I mentioned that we want to work with the Dantian. Not going to talk about this in great detail at this moment, but there is a way of developing an energy center in the lower part of the body that helps to open the internal channels of the body, being the 12 major meridians and circulating energy through them, as well as the 8 extraordinary vessels. Not needing to go into great detail of that. These help to develop the internal body and the movement of energy that is also going to flow through your internal body. Like your internal awareness of your system is developed. It's like the difference between a yogi and a dancer, depending on how the dancer practices, I suppose. But in general, with a greater emphasis on the energy and breath and developing the energy body, a yogi develops himself infinitely, because the inside is as infinite as the outside, towards a capacity to go within and know themselves and to open up new channels of energy. And the channels of energy, like the meridians I'm talking about, are understood in the Chinese system to be the movements of our mind. This is why an imbalance in the energy channels has an effect on the body, but it's also a representation on the mind, so that when you receive acupuncture or when you do good Qigong and it balances out the meridians, it also balances out your mind, yeah? It's a little different from, say, a dancer who's very externally focused on their performance, on how things look. They may have developed a very flexible, mobile, and a body that beautifully moves, primarily, once again, most likely with the external system, maybe a lot with the fascia as well. but less so with the actual qi, the energy body. So that very important first step. So there would be a different, there's a different vehicle, you could say, being built through that, right? So the first step in the internal arts is to build the correct vehicle to practice the deeper parts, which is to work with qi. Not the fascia, which many dancers have, which many martial artists have, but the qi. So the emphasis on breathing exercises, on developing a dantian, these kind of things become very primary because this is what initiates the Yi Jin Jing process. This is what allows individuals to increase their meditation and their stillness, which is the next point I'll talk about. We move from body conditioning in a very specific way to mind conditioning, building the correct qualities of mind in our practice. Once again, this is going to help us to differentiate many other external arts with the internal arts because of their particular focus. So I'm going to borrow more of the languaging for this one from yogic traditions, just to balance things out a little bit more. So when we practice the asana or the postures, and you can think of this as the forms of Qigong as we move through the sequencing, we want to hold the correct qualities of mind. The correct qualities of mind will condition the body. So when we hold the correct quality of mind, then we have a higher level of alignment. Because sometimes it's like, I see it in classes I teach, individuals are moving through the postures, but their mind isn't there. They're maybe just trying really hard, which is putting their mind in a state of contraction and stress rather than being relaxed in the postures. So they're not fully dropped into the posture with any great depth. Yoga, as many individuals know, is union. It's about being in a unified state, to speak lightly to it. And there's no way to be in a unified state if there's a lot of effort to be present from the mind. So the correct qualities of mind as articulated in the Yoga Sutras is a mind of tapas, or it's like a burning desire or discipline, even devotion could be translated as. But also like equanimity and contentment with that. It's like detachment. It's like absoluteness, like all in effort, but detachment and ease. So without struggle and without like getting huffing, puffing, sweating, that kind of thing, yeah? Purity represents a certain clarity of mind, and I'm going to come back to that one in a moment. And then there's self-study. There's more of an emphasis on self-awareness. What is the internal process and happenings in the system, from the subtle to the gross. And then surrender. Not the traditional way of defining that aspect, perhaps, but I like to say love as well. And then it's also typically known as surrender to a higher power. And I'm not going to go into great detail on that in this moment. These systems are way too vast. So as I'm talking, I'm just like getting into pieces. Like, okay, I could talk a whole podcast on that, but we're just going to pause there. Otherwise, I'll sidetrack too far. So let's touch in on purity and come back to why these mental qualities are important for our practice. The yamas and niyamas are the first two limbs of yoga. And these are known as the preparatory practices in some sense, though they're practiced alongside all the other limbs, and you don't need to just work on the first practices before going into the later stages. But if you don't have your foundations in the earlier stages, you won't get to the later stages. That's my experience, at least. My experience and my understanding. So the preparatory practices are to help you to build your foundation so that you can come into meditation and eventually samadhi, or deep states of absorption and enlightenment that lead to enlightenment. So the foundations of the niyamas are, in some sense, like observances, abstinences, codes of conduct. Don't lie, don't steal, these kinds of things. And how does that relate to meditation? Because when you're alone and you've been a liar and a cheater and a stealer, that stuff's all in your psyche. How I would express that is we're all one. So that's a imbalance of the mind, and there's something gone off in there to create that pattern in your life. And by having that in the psyche, this is not a pure mind reflecting the source of all creation, which is unconditional love. That is a derivation from that, because it's in denial of something. For example, if you kill somebody in anger, there has been a break in the true reality, which is we're all one. If you're killing them, you're killing yourself. This is the nature of your psyche in that moment then. And if that's your psyche, this is your mind, and the mind isn't clear. The mind has to be completely clear for it to know the spirit, pure consciousness, which is unadulterated by selfishness, which would be the root of that anger and the killing, yeah? So important are these ethical and you could say moral considerations for our practice. It's just not as easy to teach this whole system in a yoga class. So a lot of this stuff is taught very little or not at all because of the emphasis on physical practices, etc. But so important are they for living a good and moral life and entering deep meditation. So we have these ethical observances and abstinences, you could say. And then the niyamas is what I've articulated and translated in a way that may not be the most traditional, but discipline, equanimity, purity, self-study, and surrender being the mental qualities that help to support the practice. I'm not going to go into all of them, but let's touch on equanimity. Equanimity being a state of equality between positive and negative, between craving and aversion, helping us to touch into the true source of happiness and contentment. So if the psyche, the mind, is operating in its ordinary way, and this is like our habit pattern reaction way, we have sensations that arise in the body, and they're positive or negative, and they create either aversion being we don't like the sensation in the body, so we want to get rid of it, or it's a positive sensation and we develop an attachment to it because we crave it, we want more of it, we want more of it. Both of these polarities create suffering so long as we can't be centered, so long as we can't be in contentment with what is, so long as our life becomes a movement of orienting away from what we don't want because we're resisting things that are arising in our body, and a movement towards what we desire because we're attached to a sensation and we're continually in a state of craving it. And we're not able to just find fulfillment within ourselves and stabilize that fulfillment and move from that place where we can still enjoy pleasures, money and sex and food and all of the things, without so much of that craving of them, yeah? So that's the aim, in some sense, of developing a strong equanimity in the system. And it's a mental quality because equanimity is like the mind is above emotions in terms of the subtlety of energy. Physicality is the most dense. Emotions are less dense, but mind is even less dense than emotions. So emotions have rhythms There's high and then there's low. There's happiness and there's sadness. And these rhythms will continue to go on. They're the nature of things. But there's an opportunity to be in a higher level of perception, which is the mind of equanimity, to experience the highs and the lows without such attachment to them, like you're stuck in the waves. Instead, you're riding above the waves. There's a certain levity. And I guarantee everyone who's listening to this has experienced this at some time, and I've experienced this at some time, and sometimes I don't experience it. So there's an opportunity to cultivate this quality of equanimity through our practice. So we can do this in meditation through simply observing sensations rise and fall without reacting to them in this kind of healthily detached way. I learned this in a very, I could say, developed way through my practice of Vipassana meditation, which is another part of the origin story that I didn't talk about, but there's too many things to talk about in a podcast. I try to keep them towards an hour, and we're already approaching that. And the way we can practice this in our movement practice is as things become very noxious and very uncomfortable, we can see how we're relating to our body. If we're resistant to feel what we're feeling, we have an opportunity to practice contentment and feel relaxation wash over us from head to toe as we accept. And the more that we do this in our practice, a willingness, a conscious and deliberate willingness to be with uncomfortability, the more this develops in our system, and then we have that capacity in our life, yeah? So these qualities of mind are both gifts that we can give ourselves in our life. The more disciplined and equanimous and pure our mind becomes, the more self-studied and surrendered we are, we can offer this to our practice, and it's going to set us up for spiritual work, deeper spiritual work. Like all the work of body and mind is like getting the foundations right so that we can enter into the deeper work of the spirit and soul. Now, I realized we're almost at an hour here, and I haven't even got to spirit, and I haven't really even talked about the practice that much. So I'm not going to talk a lot about the deeper spiritual and soul aspects, but what I will share is been leading you up to this for a lot of this talk is that we transform the body, we set the foundations, and we have these qualities of mind that will help to condition the system for the alchemization as well, for the body cultivation. And these are very supportive in that, because as we hold our mind, it holds the body. And the mind is what we want to work with at the higher levels of practice. Not that we don't continue to work on the body the whole time, but ultimately in a bottoms-up system, which is the way I'm offering this, versus a top-down system. I believe I already have a podcast on that. Not going to go into great detail on that. So we have the body-up system, or bottoms-up, which works from the body up to the mind to the spirit, rather than the spirit to the mind to the body. We want to set these good foundations. And what we can enter into when we have the correct qualities of mind and body is deeper states of concentration, which can lead to meditation, which can lead to absorptions, which can lead to insights and profound realizations about the nature of reality. These realizations are knowings about the universe, universal truths that forever shift the energy and consciousness of the body. These true lookings into reality are like the Satoris of Zen. These are life-changing glimpses, even for a moment, if they happen, that forever alter the being, your understanding of your fundamental nature to the depth beyond your body and your mind, the limited constituents that are made up of the elements and the qualities of light and not going to go deeply into all the constituent parts and the models between what are the aspects of the physical and the non-physical aspects of our being and soul. Not necessary to go into at this point, but this is what the practices lead up to, yeah? In the yogic system, this is samadhi. In the Qigong, we talk about the higher levels of alchemy. Let's move on to the actual practice. As I mentioned, prescriptive application depends on where I'm teaching Wuji and why I'm teaching it. Am I teaching it in a public class where people are just dropping in who've never practiced these things? I'm not going to go into the more developed meditation practices because the foundations haven't been set there. I'm going to teach preparatory practices, working on the body's alignments, developing Wuji and stillness, working on the breath, these kinds of things. Am I teaching on retreat, where there's an opportunity to go deeper into the practices, to practice for longer periods, to give greater explanations that I can articulate some of the things that I'm sharing with you now so that people have a greater foundation and base and to go more deeply into how to work with the breath in a more developed way. Am I teaching people one-on-one where I have an opportunity to mentor them? And because this practice is very vast in its nature, because of my training in both shamanic Qigong, more of these psychotherapeutic processes and ways of working with the energy, and the Neigong process as well as the yogic process, there's a lot to go off of. And some individuals come and see me for wanting tools to regulate their nervous system and practices to work with their alignments, like their physical alignments. Other individuals are looking to clear negative emotion. Other individuals are looking for a regular practice to balance out some of their more yang external practices. I live in Squamish, so many individuals are very much into the external development of their system, whereas these practices, as I mentioned, are often about balancing our energy. Not so much about working out, but working in, like using practices that actually nourish the system, give it more energy than use more energy. And then my personal practice, of course, which is so diverse, and it's like I check in with what the energies of the day are, like how I'm personally feeling and what I'm preparing myself for. Obviously, if I'm teaching yoga in the evening, it's going to be more of a yogic practice because I want to build that energy in my system. If I have a very linear day of work, I might do a much more linear practice, meaning much more simple and focused. If I'm waking up on Saturday morning and I got a weekend where I'm about to go to a festival, I'm going to have a much more non-linear practice because I'll typically want to break free of the linear patterns of my week, my productive and time regimented week. And then I'm coming into playfulness, freedom, non-linear ways of intuiting and working with life. So I can shift the nature of my psyche in accordance with what I'm calling in. And I can do this in a small way. And I can do this in a big way, meaning I can do an hour and a half practice to do this in a big way to shift my energy. Or I can use little bits of practice. Sometimes I do like 2 minutes or 5 minute practices or 20-minute practices throughout my day. Typically practice 3 times a day, morning, sometime midday, and then evening. And I can practice in a way that's going to support my next activities. For example, if I'm having a work day and I'm working at home and I'm on the computer for a bit, I'll have a practice in the morning. And then if I'm going to go teach, like I'm going to do a video a little bit later, I'm going to want to break up that and get into something a little bit more embodied and expressive. Before I did this podcast, I sang just to open up my voice because it's early in the morning and I don't want to just wake up and come onto the podcast. I want to enliven my system before I offer my energy out, yeah? But the practice is going to have specific intentions and principles that it follows. The principles vary, and I'm not going to go over all the principles. I'm just going to go a little bit quicker as we get towards the last bit of the podcast here. Body principles, how the body is held, holding the body in a very specific way, which, for example, we want to keep the muscles very relaxed, even in active yogic postures, in as best as we can. We're not looking for an emphasis on contracting the muscles. Now, is that wrong to do? No. You can have a yogic practice. I've worked with systems and continue to work with systems that do contract the muscles more. This is just going to build the external body more than the internal body, and it's going to develop a little different than the Yi Jin Jing. As we hold the body with relaxed muscles in a very specific way, which if you want to learn well, learn it in Wuji first and then move from that place of stillness. When the body is held in that way, the bones are held up. The structure of the body is held, but the muscles and the tissues relax down. And when this is done well, what happens is it begins to put a stretch, a mild stress on the fascia. It's not a big stretch. Like when we stretch and like really stretch, like most people in yoga class want to get like a really good stretch, so they in some sense stretch to the limit. This will often stretch the muscles and the tendons, whereas if we have a light stretch, it's often we can get into like the more subtle fascia. You can experiment by just like taking your right arm and then pushing it out to the right and then pulling back all of your fingers, and then for a moment just effort that as hard as you can in the moment and just like push it out really hard, pull your fingers back, feel the stretch in the underside of the wrist most likely, and you can probably feel quite a big stretch there, yeah? And as you stretch, what happens is there's a signal from your body that it's a reflex. It's a reflex that goes, oh, okay, the nervous system is like, okay, we're getting to our point where if we stretch further in this, we might tear some shit. So don't do that right now. But if we hold on to that stretch, there's a communication from that nervous system, from the nerves in the arm, that are like, okay, am I safe to go deeper? And if we do determine, meaning the nervous system determines that it's safe to relax a little deeper, we can release some of that stretch reflex. And then the tissues begin to relax. In Qigong, we call this song or release. They begin to release. And then we can stretch further and further and further. And by working with the system, we can begin to mold the body. We can change the structure, which is largely the fascial networks that hold the wetsuit or the connective tissues that wrap around all the muscles that build the structure that hardens over time when we're slouching, and these kind of things that we're recorrecting to build the alignments again, yeah? But if we stretch really hard, we stretch mostly the muscles and the tendons. And often if we're over-efforting in our stretch, which is a pattern for some people, other people it's not efforting enough. We're always looking for a balance, yeah? And it's always represented in multiple levels. Sometimes we're efforting too much in one part of the body, say the wrist, and under-efforting in another part of the body, like with the shoulder, in a certain stretch, right? So when we want to work with the stretch reflex, we actually want to find a more comfortable edge than the over-efforting. And often less is more. Less is more, because if you holistically stretch your whole arm, if you were to do this now, as long as you're not driving, of course, if you slowly extend the arm and you feel the stretch happening in your shoulder, in your bicep, in your forearm, maybe relax it and you come back into it, relax it, come back into it. You can begin to feel the stretch, whereas you might have just felt it in the wrist because that was where you where I at least hold most of my tension, and that's where the stretch becomes most obvious. And we're all going to be different depending on how we hold tension in our bodies. But you can holistically stretch the whole arm, all the muscles and all the fascia, if you go really slowly into it and you find that nice edge, yeah? And then you can breathe more deeply, because if the muscles are too contracted, as I mentioned in the beginning, or closer to beginning, the muscles they're not as conductive towards chi, towards energy, which means the communication, which is the energy moving through the subtle channels in the nervous system, isn't as developed. So my experience with these type of stretching, it can build the external body more, get less of a stretch, and it does offer some strengthening, but it doesn't develop in the Yi Jin Jing way of transforming the body, and it doesn't develop it as holistically. Like in the Yi Jin Jing and in the development of these systems, we want to develop a relationship between all the parts in a very subtle and connected way. We don't want to overemphasize certain muscles, because we want to develop it's like a drum skin. It's like a string pulled just tight. If you drop or you touch or you pluck that string, the vibration is felt throughout the whole length of it. This is what we want to develop in the fascial system, so that when we move our pinky, we can feel it ripple all the way down to our big toe, like our pinky finger to our big toe, and from our pinky finger to the top of our head. This is the development, so that we're developing inwardly. This is subtle sensitivity. This is helping us to develop our subtle bodies, so that we don't stay external in our practice. We can develop more internally, yeah? And then we can develop the breath much, much more if we're relaxed in the system. As we begin to contract the muscle, we put the body into effort, into sympathetic tone. Remember, these practices are meditation, and they're preparation for meditation. If you're in meditation and you're in high sympathetic tone, you're not in a depth of relaxation where your mind is going to still. There's too much action and stimulation being placed on it. So as we relax the mind more, relax the breath more, then the whole system can song more, or release more, and we can learn to release different aspects of the body in a more developed way, and also to connect them, so that the body becomes a much more conducive vehicle for energy, which is going to help us when we begin to develop our dantian and then open up the subtle energy channels, the meridians, etc., opening up our mind's consciousness to our inner energy body, and thus taking us along the Yi Jin Jing process, or the internal self-cultivation process, also articulated different in the yogic systems, towards developing in this way, yeah? So it's a little bit about the body and why we want to keep the muscles relaxed. As I mentioned, there's a whole lot more I can talk to, but I'm getting towards the end here, and I don't want to make this a 2-hour podcast. And then we have the breath. What I'll say here, and I believe I made a podcast about this, if not, I've done some good writing on this, is that the breath, we want to learn active and passive breathing, 2 major skills. Active being conscious, deliberate, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, breathe through your nose, breathe through your mouth. Breathe through your nose for 4 seconds, breathe out through your nose for 4 seconds. Breathe in, pull your belly in. Breathe out, relax your belly. All these kinds of breathing patterns, so many breathing patterns, pranayama patterns, Taoist breathing patterns, Buddhist breathing patterns, so many breathing patterns. Once again, prescriptive in their application. Please be prescriptive in your application. These are powerful techniques. I am speaking from experience. I have fucked myself up so many ways because I've done improper breathing techniques. Yes, it's true. It's like you can stimulate your body with the breath. Just because you're stimulating it with the breath doesn't mean it's all natural, all good all the time. If you're stimulating your body a lot, it's just like drinking a stimulant all the time. It's stimulating. If you know how to work your energetic system really well, you can stimulate your system a hell of a lot better than you could with caffeine, and you can fry your system with the amount of energy that you move through, and you can get burnout in your kidneys. Been there, done that. Don't want to do that no more. Be proper with your practice. Most of the practices that people do, you won't run into problems because people only practice them for a very limited time, say in a yoga class. They're not practicing them regularly. They're not learning them in a very developed way, and their energy bodies and their dantian and these things aren't formed, so the practice isn't that powerful. As you move into the later stages of practices, you have to be ever more careful with how you work with your energy, because the result of your practice is so much more powerful, and thus if you're doing wrong things or things that are going to result in imbalances, and your system is so subtle in its balance and throwing things out of alignment without an understanding of the foundational energies of the system and how everything calibrates with one another. And you could lead yourself into a lot of compensations and overstimulations and just a lot of problems down the line. So be careful, learn from good teachers, learn what you know and practice what you know, and don't just do a lot of things that you've heard on the internet or learn and then just start doing it on your own unless you understand what you're doing. That's just my word of caution from my personal experience. So that's active breathing. So many active breathing patterns to stimulate, to relax, to pressurize certain body regions, to bring energy into certain organs or organ systems, to clear out energies. This could be blocked emotions, all kinds of things we can do with these breathing patterns. And the one I like to talk about a lot, because I feel like it's underemphasized, especially in our yang doing culture, is passive breathing or breath witnessing, or just allowing the breath to move in and out without control or regulation. Very challenging for many people. Very challenging because most of our life, as I mentioned, most of my life, till I entered into deeper levels of stillness, was a result of continual movement of the mind from my conditioning. Mind always moving from one desire to the next. Craving, seeking. So to actually not do anything means to not control or regulate the state, which is like developing equanimity, right? This is a very specific training and very difficult. Habit, pattern, and compulsion is try to create a good feeling in the body and orient towards it, and effort, or do a breathing pattern to get there. So many people will find when they try to just witness the breath, they end up controlling the breath. This is a control pattern that is attempting to bring them into a state of regulation or safety, which is often a mechanism for avoidance of not wanting to feel something they're averse to, or it's just the habit pattern compulsion of their craving for a positive sensation. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. So, learning to let go of the breath is a practice. It has to be practiced because it's not something taught in our culture. It's not something embodied in our culture. Efforting is very much rewarded in our culture because of the obvious results of it and because of the conditioning of how our culture has been moving. Learning to let go and develop things like Wu Wei, which is non-doing, and effort from a place of non-doing, a Chinese Taoist term, is a way of establishing your center, your stillness, just like I talked about Wuji, establishing this and establishing a way of non-efforting with the breath that's deep, that's equanimous, so that when you do move through effort, there's a non-effortness. This also pairs in with the non-muscular activation of learning to move with your energy and mind as opposed to the more physical aspects of you. It's literally like learning to move from a cloud space instead of moving through the world through your physicality. It's not always supported because I've gone through the Yi Jin Jing process, or I'm going through it, pardon me. I stopped working out, as I mentioned, for the last 6 months. I lose muscle in that time. The conditioning of the ideal of a man is very muscular in the Western culture. Not like that around the world, but in the Western culture, muscles, external muscles, are very much the ideal. So there is a certain detachment that is learned when an individual goes through some of these processes. Not saying they can't have muscle, as I mentioned, it's just counterproductive at certain points in the practice and development. This is why periodization comes in, yeah? But there can be some detachment of the cultural expectations of a beautiful body. Anyways, coming back to passive breathing, so important. It's actually a foundational practice that should I'm saying should be practiced before active practices. I'm saying should because it's just an offering from my personal experience. You can do what you want. You are your own master. But unless we establish a base of equanimity and passive breathing, all of our patterns are, as I mentioned, going to be more in alignment with control patterns because we're doing them from that place of seeking something because we're not in our center. Does that make sense? If we're established in our stillness, equanimity, and a capacity to just be with our breath and be with our body as it is, then we're rooted in our own contentment. And then if we take action from there, it's from a whole different center. Then if we don't have that place of stillness and contentment, that all rightness with being who we are without needing to shift anything, then we're just trying to shift anything to feel good, right? So we're on that same pattern of aversion and craving. So establishing breath awareness, breath passiveness, breath witnessing, however you want to call it, just a capacity to be with yourself and be with your breath without changing it, is a foundation if you want to go anywhere with these practices. And then mind, we talked about the mental qualities, so I'm not going to go deep into that. Speeding up my voice once again, so as we're getting towards the end here. We want to move from a place of stillness. I talked a lot about this in the beginning, moving from Wuji. I'm not going to touch on it greater because I think I spoke enough about it and I feel happy and content with that. And proper sequencing is so important for these practices. Once again, I fucked myself over by not properly integrating practices, following the correct way. And I say correct way, not because I'm trying to be a drill sergeant and tell people their way is wrong, but just from my personal experience of what is most effective and in my understanding of the teachings as I understand them from the classics, is that we want to, for example, at the end of a yogic practice, you come into Shavasana. This is not something that we choose to do if we want to or not. It's essential for the practice. I'll share one reason why. If you stimulate your body, you put it into sympathetic arousal, and you've activated all these movement sequences, in order for your body to properly integrate that information, it needs a period of rest. Our body naturally does this in a day cycle, as we are awake during the day and sleep during the night. But if you want to, in a more developed, in a faster way to evolve, you could say, you could have multiple of these awake cycles and then rest cycles. Rest not meaning sleep necessarily, but integration cycles where you integrate the movements and the information being processed in the system. But you're not just doing that to integrate the information, you're establishing a center which is still and stable. This is why the cadence of Qigong is often stand, move, simple movement, stand, move, stand, move. Now, not always necessary to practice like this, but it's an excellent way to practice if you really want to develop the energy body and this cadence and develop stillness in your practice. If you fall out of this, if you overstimulate your body and then you don't rest, you keep that momentum in the system. High level of sympathetic arousal. You go eat after perhaps. Now you're still in sympathetic arousal. Maybe you don't even slow down to eat. Still in sympathetic arousal. You go work for the day. Maybe at the end of the day, you practice again. Finally, at bedtime, you've been in sympathetic arousal for most of the day. And then you sleep. Versus practice, come out of sympathetic arousal into parasympathetic relaxation, eat, digest more fully, have more energy, go into arousal during work, have an integration, See, we're learning to work with the rhythms and intelligence of the body. So that's proper sequencing. I'm not going to share more about the principles because of our time here today. I want to make this in a nice compressed way. Maybe I'll make another podcast about this. Let's just touch back into why you should care about these practices, why they benefit me. So now that I've talked a little bit about it, I can share a little bit more about the things that I've shared before, such as empowerment and embodiment. These practices are all based on individuals becoming empowered, connected to their breath, the source, resourced in the source of life. Embodiment, you choose how you show up to these practices. I think what's missing in a lot of yogic practices is the embodiment. Like when I look at people's faces, it's like when you open up your phone and your camera opens up and you see your face and it's like a stone monkey. And it's like, oh yeah, the full embodiment of these practices is perhaps a little smile or confidence on the face. There's like another dimension to add into there. And it's all like preparation. It's all preparation for meditation. It's all preparation for the way we want to live. It's an opportunity to cultivate our mind and our body so that we can show up as the person we want to be through these practices. Self-regulation, self-healing, self-realization. Self-healing, well, particularly through the medical Qigong practices, but all of the work here is about balancing the system for the optimal alignments, to balancing out the emotional energies, the mind's energies, leads to self-healing, self-regulation through the breath, self-realization. Not even going to speak about that. That's the end result of all this beautiful stuff that we do. Intuition increases in your internal guidance. So there's major centers of information processing in the body, such as your cognition, your brain, your emotions, and your physical, your intuition, your body-based intuition. When you practice and you're breathing and you're connected to your body, the rhythms and the oscillators in the body line up and you make better decisions that are more coordinated with your mind, your heart, and your body. For example, if you're more of a cognitive, cerebral person, maybe less connected to the body, that affects your decision making more in the mind. These practices can help to teach individuals to become more connected to their total intelligence. Yeah, every cell in your body's got a long history of all the DNA of your ancestors in there. We want to tap into this infinite intelligence, yeah? These practices teach us balance, mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, which ultimately balance our system, but the way we live. I see this in, I live in Squamish. I'm in the Sea to Sky corridor. Many people who live fast lives, snowboarders and mountain bikers, there's so much doing. This isn't a judgment on that. This is just a observation on their pattern. It's like do this and then do this and do this and then do this. It's like there's so much yang energy. And when an individual practices more meditation, they open up that pathway as a pattern that they can practice both in their body and in their lifestyle. Now, we have cultural energy and what the masses do and what's available as per like commercial offerings. So this is becoming more and more a thing. Other countries in different parts of the world have more of a developed way of relaxing and spending time relaxing. The West traditionally has been a much more doing-based culture. My sense is that it was a bunch of doers who would leave the eastern continent of Europe and India and Asia, India, the part of Asia, pardon me, and to come over here. So yeah, a lot of doers who were the forefounders of this place. So it makes sense that their ancestors and children would carry on that tradition. And now it's becoming more balanced as East meets West, and no longer East is West and West is East. And we're becoming more balanced in our masculine and feminine and these polarities for sure. But these practices give us that. Like As a practitioner of these arts and a solo entrepreneur, I feel a lot of pressure in some sense, a lot of pressure from myself and from the culture around me and the competition to put out a certain way and to have a certain quality of energy that allows me to keep up with the, you could say, the standards of business and productivity in this environment. So even somebody as developed in these arts as I am, and as I mentioned, still a beginner, but a regular beginner, it can be something that I really have to like take a very concerted effort to regulate my system and to develop a schedule that allows me to have enough time in relaxation, because along with my improper practice I've also overworked and become compulsive in that, and I've also practiced in ways that support that, becoming overly yang, which had contributed to burnout and these kinds of things. So this about intelligent and deliberate awareness of what's going on in the system and the life, and to have practices that are supportive of that. And for most people, a lot of balancing practices in the West are so deeply nourishing, they may resist it. They may come to class and be like, I want a really good stretch, I want to effort, I want to push really hard, because that's the way they've been living their life, and that's the way that they feel like is going to support them, and it will have a support for sure. New movement patterns and intelligence is activated through these systems. But what is often most supportive for many individuals is not the practice that they want, it's the practice that they need. And a lot of that is often to do with stillness and finding these uncomfortable places that come up when we try to just leave our breath alone. As a breathwork instructor, this is very much what I work on. Often the person who wants to come in here and breathe like hyperventilation, like and activate their body and stimulate, which is not what they often intend to or want, but is often going to be the thing that balances out their system, which ultimately will give them more energy to do all the things that they want to do. Or maybe even not. Maybe they've been doing all those things like I had in my life because of a lot of momentum and compulsiveness from an earlier part in my life. And that when I started to give up some of those things, I realized I can open up new doors and find different parts of myself that I had left behind or I had yet to discover, and I could live a more balanced life. Yeah. These practices help with your alignment, physical, energetic, your alignment with your dreams. You have a dream, you want to focus on it, you want to be able to hold it in your consciousness so that every breath and step has a rippling effect of your vibration and energy attuned to this goal. Yeah. So how are you going to focus your mind in that way with the many distractions of life, of social media and people selling you things and pulling you in all different directions? If you want inner stability of mind, this is the internal arts, the complete systems of transforming the body and the mind so that we're aligned to what we want as conscious creators in our life. Optimizing your energy. A lot of these practices are about doing things well, doing things right in a good way. Often this means slowing down, and so you could do an output of this much. Who cares in this practice? Maybe you just want to work on doing it so slow that you do one repetition of whatever the movement is, but you're so mindful and present that you can feel every subtle ripple through your fascia and your bones, and you can get to know your organs for the first time in your life. Did you know that you can feel your organs? Maybe you haven't even felt them your whole life. When you become very still and quiet and move really slowly, you can feel the weight of your liver as it moves. And as you get to know your liver, you may feel, oh, there's some pain in the liver, and get to know the body and begin to breathe into those places, optimize the energy, get to know the body more. Yeah. As you get to know the body more, alchemize what is there, stuck and blocked energy, holding patterns, the diaphragms, the fascial networks. We hold the story of yesterday in our body, so we practice today so that we have more expansion for tomorrow, yeah? Movement intelligence is increased. As I mentioned, this is prescriptive exercise activity. This is something that is done in a very good way so that you can increase your repertoire. I talked a little bit about if you have a certain activity, or how I do this, how I have certain activities and I want to prepare myself. I do practices to prepare myself. Whether this is dance for more non-linearity or playfulness, or more of a hard workout if I want empowerment and power in my system, confidence, these kinds of things, yeah? And then breath awareness. Breath awareness is spiritual awareness. It's consciousness awareness. The breath guides the mind. The breath initiates the process of life itself. This is the difference between reactivity and response, the capacity to have an intimate relationship with the breath as the vehicle of life, as your vehicle for conscious to move to the subconscious, to know the deeper parts of your energy and body. Breath awareness has so many dimensions. I talked a little bit about passive and active breathing. There's so much I could talk about the breath, but we're at the end of the podcast here. I talked about everything that I wanted to talk about. And this is Wuji, the system that is just beginning, and I'm just a beginner in this practice, but I've been a beginner for a long time, and I appreciate being able to share what I do know about these teachings and practices. I offer regular classes at Shala Yoga at the time of this sharing of this podcast, at least, at Yoga Shala Yoga at 4:15 to 5:30 every Wednesday. I had the flow class. I have a Wuji Qigong event on March 9th from 2 to 4, and I'll be looking to do more of a regular Wuji class, as the Shala class is more of a yoga class, though it has Wuji elements, whereas I will be teaching more of a Wuji based class soon enough, where I can go deeper into what I've described here. If you do want to work with me one-on-one, I am available with my Wuji practices, as well as breathwork and other holistic energy medicine practices. And I will be doing a number of retreats this year, and other opportunities like more workshops to learn some of these practices, and sharing on my social media and my YouTube videos that you can follow along with. Thank you for listening, and have a blessed day. I hope you have the best day ever after you finish listening to this. Enjoy yourself, enjoy the stillness of being, enjoy the depth of your breath wherever it's at. Aho.